If I told you that there was a real-life hijacking of a train where terrified hostages were held for 20 days in terrible conditions, a hijacking that involved flying jet fighters just over the roof of the train to shockwave the terrorists, a hijacking where the whole thing ended in a bloodbath with thousands of bullets fired, and all of this happened in Europe, you'd think you'd know about it, right? Well, almost nobody remembers this. So, in this channel's spirit of telling unknown or forgotten stories, here is the tale of the Free South Moluccan Youth movement and the 1970s Dutch train hijackings. So if you're anything like me, your initial reaction might be, who the heck are the South Moluccans and why on earth are they hijacking trains in Holland in the 1970s? Okay, well here's a really simplified broad brushstroke history of what was going on and who was involved. So the Moluccas are part of an island archipelago located between Sulawesi and New Guinea. If you look at a map, they're shown as the Indonesian provinces of Maluku and North Maluku. Historically, they were known as the Spice Islands, one of the few places in the world where cloves and nutmeg were found, and as such presented an obvious economic goldmine for the colonial-era megacorporations like the Dutch East India Company. That was later replaced by the Dutch state, leading to the islands becoming part of what was known then as the Dutch East Indies. By the end of the Second World War, after the Japanese occupation of the islands had weakened Dutch influence, a new call for independence arose, and the state of Indonesia was declared on August 17, 1945. But like most things in life, it just wasn't that simple. The Dutch East Indies weren't just one group of people living under Dutch rule. It was a patchwork of hundreds of ethnic groups, languages, religious identities, and not everybody wanted to be part of this new Indonesia. Some islanders saw it as just swapping one master for another, and some islanders definitely preferred Dutch rule to being under the control of Java. The South Moluccans fell into this latter camp, and as such they fought alongside the Dutch forces during the 4-year-long conflict when the Netherlands tried unsuccessfully to keep hold of the Dutch East Indies. Anyway, to cut a very long and complicated story short, the upshot of all this was that when the Dutch packed up and left in 1950, it left the South Moluccans who had fought with them in a very precarious position. They could either stay and face the very real danger of mob reprisal, imprisonment, torture and death, or they could take up the Dutch offer of relocation and get themselves and their families out of Indonesia. Between March and June of 1951, some 3,500 soldiers and their families, it was around 12,500 people in all, were evacuated by sea to the Netherlands. This was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but as it happened, it ended up being permanent. Reading between the lines, it seems that the Dutch government didn't do itself any favours by promising the South Moluccans that this was all going to be just temporary, and giving them the unspoken promise that they, the Dutch, would somehow sort out South Moluccan independence, and that one day everyone could just go home. All of that was a pipe dream and the government knew it. But for years they kept the South Moluccans just hanging on, stuck in Holland but not really part of Dutch society. Okay, fast forwards to the mid-1970s and the situation is as follows. The South Moluccan community had grown to around 35 to 40,000 people, but it was mostly insular and still very much apart from mainstream Dutch society. Emphasis was placed on maintaining Moluccan identity and loyalty to the non-existent Republic of South Maluku, the imagined and longed-for independent Moluccan homeland. Now, it was this second generation born in the Netherlands that had really taken this idea to heart, and they viewed it as a kind of mythic utopia, sort of birthright, but one that had been denied to them by the weak and ineffectual Dutch state. And it was from this crop of disaffected youth that the hijackers came. Prior to the high-profile train hijackings, this radicalised group, calling itself the Free South Moluccan Youth, had already made some headlines in 1970, when 33 of them stormed the residence of the Indonesian ambassador, taking him and his family hostage. During this 12-hour standoff, the ambassador managed to escape, but policeman Hans Molenaar was shot and killed. The hostage-takers finally surrendered to police. Now, the Dutch response to this seems to me to have been extraordinarily lenient, as sentences of just 4 months to 3 years were handed down. That was it. And what the Dutch intelligence services were doing at this point is anyone's guess, as this was just the start of a whole series of attacks about which the Dutch government seemed to be blissfully unaware. The next wave of terror took place in 1975 and began in the spring with the attempted kidnap of Queen Juliana, when 17 Free Moluccan Youth terrorists were apprehended driving a truck full of weapons towards the royal palace. The intention was to ram the gate, break into the palace and nab the Queen. Once again, comparatively light sentencing from the Dutch authorities was the order of the day. The first train hijacking took place on December 2, 1975, when 7 Moluccan terrorists seized control of a regional commuter train travelling between Groningen and Zwolle. One terrorist pulled the emergency cord, bringing the train to a halt in open countryside, and the remaining hijackers pulled out weapons and screamed that they were now in control of the train. One then banged on the door of the forward compartment and, when it opened, shot the driver, 30-year-old Hans Brahm, at point-blank range, killing him instantly. In sub-zero temperatures, a tense standoff began, but Dutch authorities seemed unwilling to storm the train even when, on day 3, the hijackers executed 22-year-old soldier Leo Bolter, and on the following day, in full view of the press, military and police, executed 33-year-old Bert Verhoeff in the open doorway of the train, throwing his body out onto the tracks. It was absolute cold-blooded murder committed in front of the other hostages and the watching world, but there was no end in sight. The negotiations continued for another agonising 9 days. And believe it or not, at the same time as the train hijack, Moluccan terrorists had also seized the Indonesian consulate in Amsterdam, taking 16 children and 25 adults hostage, forcing them up to the top floor and threatening to throw the kids off the roof if their demands were not met. Blindfolded hostages were paraded out on the upper balconies while the government delivered daily food and continued negotiations. One desperate hostage jumped from a second-floor window, dying later on from his injuries. This siege dragged on for over 2 weeks until the gunmen finally surrendered after the government made some vague promises which seemed to appease them. Back on the train, the standoff continued, apart from by now everybody was slowly freezing to death and the hostages kept on escaping from the train at night. This hijack finally ended on December the 14th without further bloodshed, when a bunch of very cold and traumatised hostages were released, and a bunch of very cold and miserable terrorists were arrested. By now you might be wondering what it was all about. What were the demands? What were they trying to achieve? Well, to me, it all seems to have been a little bit vague and idealistic. Most demands seem to want the Dutch government to either magically spirit into being the promised South Moluccan Republic, or alternatively, to go in front of the United Nations and claim a case for said republic. All of this murder, terror and tragedy for something that was just not going to happen. It was crazy. And yet they were determined. The machine guns, grenades, pistols and hunting rifles showed it. Now, maybe I'm doing the Dutch a disservice here, but again, no life sentences were handed down, which seems a bit weak considering the crimes that had been committed. There's a perception that the Dutch were more interested in community cohesion and not taking the threat of violent extremism seriously enough, as by 1977, the Moluccans were at it again. This time, 9 heavily armed terrorists pulled the emergency brake on a busy commuter train, bringing it to a halt in the countryside outside of Punt, while 4 other armed terrorists took 110 children and their teachers hostage in the village school at Bovensmilde. It seemed that this was becoming the new normal in the Netherlands, but this time around it wouldn't end with some easy jail time. No, this time around it was going to end in blood. On the 23rd of May 1977 at around 9 in the morning, the emergency brake was pulled on the commuter service between Assen and Groningen, bringing the train to a halt outside the small village of Punt. And so the second Moluccan train hijacking began. 40 people, including the train crew, were let off the train, and 54 passengers were taken hostage. Blankets and newspapers were placed over the windows, and the male and female hostages were moved to separate carriages. The hijackers made their demands. The Dutch government had to recognise the independent Republic of South Molucca, 21 Moluccan terrorists were to be released from jail, and a jumbo jet was to be provided to fly them all out of the country. If this didn't happen, they would blow up the train with everyone on board. To prove that they were serious, 3 hostages were brought outside and paraded around with nooses around their necks. These demands, however, were not met, but the hijackers didn't go through with the threat to blow up the train. Instead, a tense standoff began, with Dutch negotiators attempting to talk the terrorists down. The watching press kept cameras focused on the train. Was this to be another Bert Verhoeff type scenario? Only time would tell. In tandem with the train hijack, 4 armed Moluccan terrorists seized control of the primary school in Bovensmilde, taking 105 children and 5 teachers hostage. However, within 4 days, all of the children had been released as a mystery stomach illness swept through the school. Later reports suggested that the children's food, which was brought in by the negotiators, may have been dosed with laxative to speed along the release process. Back on the train, progress had stalled. On the 4th of June, a couple of well-regarded Moluccan community members, Jazina Sumakil and Hassan Tan, were brought in to help with face-to-face negotiations, and the following day 2 pregnant women were released as a sign of good faith. However, at the second meeting on June the 9th, Sumakil may have slipped the hijackers the news that the newly formed Marxist-Leninist Republic of Benin had stated it was willing to take them in. Possibly sensing a way out, the hijackers' resolve now seemed to harden, and they again began to threaten to kill all the hostages. But by now, the Dutch had their own plan for ending the siege, and it was a plan that didn't involve all the hijackers merrily flying off to sunny Benin. During the 19 days of negotiations, Dutch Marines had been brought in to create a secure perimeter around the train, and they'd noticed something that they thought could be used to their advantage. At the start, the male and female hostages had been split up and moved to adjacent carriages, but as well as that, the terrorists had also split into 3 groups, and they seemed to be keeping to set areas of the train. Most of the time there was one group in the north end of the train, one group in the south end, and one hijacker in the corridor between the men and women. If they stayed like this, and they seemed to be doing just that, there was a good chance to take them out without the hostages being killed. A plan was put together and approved, and at 4:54 a.m. on the 11th of June, that plan went into action. At 5:54 in the early morning light, without warning and simultaneously, multiple Dutch Marine marksmen opened fire on the train, striking the front, rear and centre zone where the hijackers are thought to be clustered. At the same time, 3 Lockheed starfighters are sent in low and fast, just above the roof of the train. Explosive charges are set off near the train to simulate bombs dropping. And in the immediate confusion, several groups of commandos storm the train. Upon boarding, one commando group entered the dining car and finding one wounded hijacker there, opened fire and killed her. The commando groups then quickly moved up and down the train, subduing 2 hijackers that wanted to surrender and securing the male passengers. However, when entering the car where the female passengers were being held, one hijacker opened fire. Chaos ensued when female hostages started fleeing for the exit, a flashbang grenade was thrown, and that hijacker was also subdued. Finally, the assault was made on the southern end of the train where the leader of the terrorists was thought to be holed up. But as the commandos moved through those compartments, they found all 3 already dead, killed by the marksmen at the outset. Within just 5 minutes, all of the hijackers had been neutralised. Jets had been flown in, charges had been blown, grenades thrown, and thousands of rounds of ammunition fired. 6 hijackers were dead, and 2 hostages had been killed in the crossfire. But the train had been secured. The wounded were taken to hospital, the remaining hijackers were arrested, and the very relieved hostages were free at last. The remaining hostages at the school in Bovensmilde were freed after an armoured car rammed the school building and the terrorists surrendered. They had heard about how the train hijack had ended, and I guess they didn't want to end up the same way. The surviving train hijackers and the school hostage takers were all convicted and sentenced between 6 and 9 years in jail. Unsurprisingly, the actions of the Free South Moluccan Youth movement did absolutely nothing to advance the creation of the promised South Moluccan Republic. Indeed, to this day it does not exist, and it seems likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. The one thing that these terrorist actions did succeed in doing was to thoroughly harden Dutch public opinion against the Moluccan community, as, on the whole, it seemed that the community in general supported the use of violence against the citizens of the Netherlands. No apology for the actions of the Free Youth was ever given, and, as if to underscore the feeling of animosity, instead there were small-scale riots by Moluccans in the lead-up to the sentencing of the hijackers. Now, it's hard for me to say definitively what the Moluccans feel about the spree of violence in the 70s, but it appears that there are still some lingering sympathies for the hijackers. In 2007, a memorial service for the slain hijackers was held, a service which was attended by over 600 people. More recently, there have been attempts made by relatives of the deceased hijackers to hold the Dutch state accountable for the use of excessive force. In 2017, human rights lawyers were brought in to represent the families, and a case was brought against the Dutch state, alleging that the hijackers were, in effect, executed by the Marines. But ultimately, the appeal courts decided that there was no case to answer. One thing that did surprise me when researching this topic was the amount of modern-day hand-wringing about the shooting of the hijackers, especially from the Dutch mainstream media, which I'd have to say does seem to have quite a sympathetic view towards these terrorists. I mean, I get it, they had problems and broken promises, but, who doesn't these days? In my opinion, if you're going to take people hostage, threaten to throw children from rooftops, kidnap people, threaten to blow up trains, and publicly execute people in cold blood, well, don't be surprised if you end up on the wrong side of a bullet. If you're going to play with matches, you're going to get burned. Maybe that's an unfashionable view these days, but at any rate, that's how I see it. Today, the idea and hope for the Republic of South Molucca is definitely still alive and well in the Netherlands, although there have been no killings, kidnappings or hijackings for decades. The Dutch Moluccan people there still celebrate the culture, the language and the traditions of their ancestors, which is more than can be said for the South Moluccans in Indonesia itself, where just waving a Republic of Molucca flag is enough to get you arrested.